Hello everybody, this is B. Harper from supermarcy.com and welcome back. Now, as you can see, I have wolf woman hair. Yes! Would you believe I have not cut my hair since April last year? So this is basically more than a year's growth. Not that bad. But look, I didn't just come here to discuss my hair and other frivolous things. I am back again in force to discuss some LGBT based horror films, and this one is particularly prolific, and that is Interview with the Vampire, made in 1994, directed by Neil Jordan, and starring Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Antonio Banderas, Christian Slater, and a very young Kirsten Dunst, like really young. So a very brief history on my experience with the film. I first recall hearing its name when I was in 6th or 7th grade. It was quite a while ago, if that gives you any indication about how old I am. But here's what I remember in general, or rather this is what I remember other children who had supposedly seen this movie said. There was lots of blood and there was lots of naked ladies. And I was basically at that age when that sort of thing didn't necessarily appeal to me, but I always kept it at the back of my mind. So when I turned 16 and I was starting to get into the whole sort of vampires are cool phase that basically every adolescent goes into, especially adolescent females, I revisited Interview with the Vampire. Well, not revisited, but watched it for the very first time in full, and yeah, I was quite taken by it. And while I was watching the film, it occurred to me that when I first heard it being discussed in the schoolyard and during lunchtime, there was no mention to the homosexual overtones of the film. And I don't mean undertones, I mean overtones. Because, let's face it, Interview with a Vampire is a very sort of homoerotic vampire film, namely between the two leads of Lestat and Louis, played by Cruise and Pitt respectively. And that's really interesting to me because you'd think, since it is such a huge factor in the film, like, it would be disgustable. Like, those kids would have said a lot more about, you know, how close to kissing the characters of Lestat and Louis were. But no, I don't remember it ever being discussed. And as time went on, and as I got older and I gradually got out of the vampire phase, I started to sort of see the film from another perspective. Partly because I had read the books of which the films were based, the Vampire Chronicles. And I'm personally not that big of a fan of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles books, but I think her Mayfair Witches stories are amazing, as well as some of her standalone novels, such as The Mummy. But I have read Interview with a Vampire, so I feel I can add a little more credence to my discussion. So the way Anne Rice writes her characters, namely the characters of Lestat and Louis and their relationship for that matter, it's very melodramatic, and that is very echoed in the movie. But at the same time, Rice manages to add a sense of human dimension to these vampiric characters. Because if you remember, in my Embrace of the Vampire review, I asked the question as to whether or not a vampire can love. And by that I mean love in a human way, the way that we as human beings are able to identify and practice love. But to me, with vampires it's incredibly different because they're not human. They're the blood-sucking demons that have taken over a human body but don't have the same chemistry, if you will, of the human species. So for them to feel love is a very sort of different sensation to how you and I would feel. But Rice manages to add something a little more human to the vampire relationships. When a vampire in those stories love, it's not just, I feel sexually attracted to you. It's more along the lines of, I can see us spending an eternity together in a very sort of literal sense. And that approach to, what is admittedly a very fantastic genre is quite refreshing, because Rice took the time to explain how a vampire is able to feel how it feels. And in the case of the film, it is more or less explored, but as with any other sort of film adaptation of a book, you have to condense a few things, you have to sort of narrow it down just to sort of put it into an acceptable runtime. But for the most part, Interview with a Vampire, the film, takes the time for you to get to know these characters, to make you see their connections and how they are compatible or how they could not be compatible. In the case of Lestat and Louis, let's face it, it was quite non-consensual, because Lestat was looking for a companion. Louis was pretty much intent on ending his own life. But when Lestat bit him, and Louis felt that pain, Louis didn't want to die. So in a sense, he was forced into the immortality that Lestat put on him. But as time went on, they gradually started to find some sort of connection. But that connection didn't come from the fact that Lestat loved to kill and Louis didn't. Louis for the longest time was so hesitant and so reluctant to kill the human species because he still had that mortal coil. Lestat, meanwhile, had pretty much given up on that because it was holding him back. And he was trying to tell Louis, you got to start drinking from humans sooner or later, because let's face it, buddy, you're not like them anymore. So therefore, it's in that quote that Lestat has to Louis, God kills indiscriminately, and so shall we. Simple as that. But going back to the whole sort of LGBT theme of the film, I am so amazed at how sort of sensitively and respectfully it's portrayed, despite the initial fantasticness of the situation. Look, let's face it, Lestat and Louis almost become like a married couple. They just happen to be male, like in physique, and they just happen to be a vampire. And that to me is quite exciting, because you don't see that sort of seriousness being paid to a homosexual relationship in a very good horror movie. Apart from that, Interview with a Vampire is sumptuously made. Very good direction. Yes, that the melodrama is there, but that's all part and parcel of the story. You got to have some sort of heightened situation to go along with your heightened characters, and Interview with a Vampire manages to nail that. But is it necessarily a perfect film? No film is perfect. But that just comes from the fact that it may not necessarily be for everyone. And when I say that, there is a lot of heady content in this movie. I mean, considering it was made in 1994, the sort of stuff that you see in the film was quite shocking, to tell you the truth. These days we see a naked lady and say, oh, that's, we've seen that before. We're not necessarily shocked by that. Aroused, yes. But shocked? No. So back in 1994, to see all this blood and nudity and seeing this homoerotic relationship between two male characters, that sort of thing was still a rarity. In Western cinema terms. So in a sense, Interview with a Vampire managed to trailblaze quite a few things. Not the least of which is showing a more honest and less insulting interpretation of homosexuality, but given just a little more dosage in terms of the horror context. Interview with a Vampire is very fascinating. It may not necessarily be honest, and it's probably not the fairest representation of a male-on-male relationship, but in the way Rice has written it, she never did it to condemn or insult, the gay community. I feel she wanted to include them in the circles of horror, and perhaps her way of doing it was making it like a gothic, erotic romance. but with blood and gore involved. So I give Neil Jordan's Interview with a Vampire a 4.5 out of 5. The reason why I deduct half a point is namely because it's hard to put my finger on it, but when you're 16 years old and you see a film like that, it affects you greatly. But as time goes on, some of the impact is lost on you just from a nostalgic perspective. But as a film, it holds up incredibly well, with fantastic performances, especially from a young Kirsten Dunst as a young Claudia. She displayed a maturity way beyond her years, just like the character of Claudia. Because Claudia was essentially a woman in a child's body, and she was growing to resent that. But that's a whole nother story in the film. But as a horror that focuses on the LGBT element, it is very effective. And may I say, it's actually quite sexy. And I say that as a mostly straight female. It all comes down to how much you're willing to accept. If you're willing to look past the fact that these are vampires and technically not capable of human love, I think you'll have a very good time with this movie. And if you are gay, I don't know. I'd like to hear back from you about what you think about this movie in terms of how it represents your orientation and how well it manages to incorporate something as mainstream as horror and sort of meld that with LGBT themes in it. So, yeah, check it out, and I shall see you on the flip. See you later.